Welcome back to my 6th video on my series on using Nina. And things are just about to get really interesting because we're going to get into the heart of the advanced sequencer. Now, in the previous videos I've shown you how you can use the framing tab and the sky atlas to pull in an image, work out the center and the framing coordinates and pass those onto a simple sequence which you can then convert to an advanced sequence and modify. In this video we're going to start from scratch, so I'm not going to use the framing wizard as it is at the moment, but come back to it a little bit later on. So for instance, if I now want to start a sequence from scratch, I need to go to the instructions tab up here and use all of these down here to create the sequence instructions, the loop conditions and the triggers. There are 3 at the top that you have to use. So there's a deep sky object sequence, there's a parallel instruction set and a sequential instruction set. And these are the 3 main building blocks of any sequence. Now, of the 3, the parallel one is the one that's least used, and for the moment I'm going to get rid of it because it's really just a special case of the sequential one. So the difference between a sequential instruction set and a deep sky object sequence is the addition of a target, and if I minimize that you see that they're basically the same. If you don't bring in an image, frame and target from the framing wizard, the only way you can actually bring up this target dialog is to use the deep sky object sequence here. With this blank target you can populate it by a number of means. You can type in the coordinates directly. You can also pull it in from the planetarium, and having done a basic target, say for instance putting in the coordinates for the middle of a nebula, you can also send the coordinates back to the framing wizard, refine the actual framing and orientation of the frame, and then send it back again and populate the information with the latest slight fine-tuned position and angle. Well, that's not strictly true. This specific target information block also comes in with both targets and also some templates. So for instance, if I scrub this out completely and just get rid of it and drag in a target, this target will include not only the target information of the deep sky object, but it also includes in this particular case a set of exposure conditions at different binning levels and so on. And so you have a complete set of information here in order to take the target, which is useful, but sometimes all you want is the target information at the top here. If I delete that and go into instructions and do deep sky object sequence, which has got no information in the instruction part or the loop part, and then I go into the targets and drag the same target information onto here, all that happens is it populates the target information in here, but it doesn't alter the instructions. So depending on how you're approaching this, you might want something that's ready-made with the types of exposures that are useful for that target, which you probably predetermined. Or if you want to start from a blank sheet, this is another way of doing it. But the behavior changes depending what's on screen when you drag it on. The other thing to think about is something called templates. And we haven't mentioned templates up to now, but this is a good time to start. So templates are sets of instructions, and if you click the little expansion buttons you can see what they do. So there's one in the standard settings called end, startup and target. So if we do the target one and drag it onto here, this is a ready-made template which has been populated with a blank target and a set of instructions that it thinks will be useful to you. And you can use this as a starting point or just use it as is. So this will be something similar to the simple sequencer generating an advanced sequence when you convert it. And you can see all the things that are going on, the slewing, the centering, the autofocus and so on. This is quite a useful starting point, and certainly worked examples are useful to give you insights as to how to do things. But I'm trying not to cheat at the moment. I want to sort of go back to the basics. So for the moment, I'm going to get rid of that and just simply start with a deep sky object sequence, which is entirely blank. And to this, I'm going to add some instructions, loop conditions, and triggers. Let's add some camera exposures. On the right-hand side, you can see there are several ways of taking exposures. You can take many, one, or smart exposure. And the difference between them is they roll up a lot of common controls into one handy instruction. So I'm going to use smart exposure and drag it onto the instructions. And if you can see, it says there's going to be 2 exposures, no duration, so I need to change the duration. It's a light type, binning 1 by 1, the gain from the camera, offset from the camera. It has the ability to select a filter, and there's a dither command every 1 frame. So I'm going to put 2 frames, or if I don't want any dither at all, I just make it 0. So I'm going to make it 2 frames. And that's a very quick way of making a set of exposures. So I've got 2 exposures of red. So I'm going to increase that to 10 exposures of red. And I can quickly duplicate that using the submenu. And then change this to green and change this to blue. So now I have a sequence of 10 red, 10 green and 10 blue. And it'll just go through this the once because there are no loop conditions. If I now want to make this target a physical object in the sky rather than just where the telescope happens to be pointing, I can either add the target information from the framing tab, or I can bring it in from my targets tab. Now I showed previously that I can drag this target and it will populate the target information, but equally you can go into your framing tab and pull up a sequence like this and then say add target to sequence. And if you look at here, it says update existing target in sequencer. So this has now highlighted itself because we actually have a target in the sequencer. So hit that, and in the sequencer now you can see that the information has been populated. This will just simply go through this the once. So perhaps what we want to do is cycle through these multiple times until it gets light again in the morning. So under loop conditions, I can say loop until time. So that time might be astronomical dawn. Now that's okay, but if you look at your trajectory of your object, you see that it sets before dawn. So there's a better way of doing this, to say, well, let's loop until we get to this point in time, which is around midnight. So you could technically just type in midnight here. But another way of doing it is using this and saying not loop until time, but just get rid of that for a second, and add a loop condition that says loop until altitude sets below. So at the moment it says loop until altitude sets below 30 degrees. I could also alternatively add a loop condition that says loop while altitude is above horizon. So that's perhaps a more intelligent way of doing it, because what it's doing is it's saying I will continue to loop round these sets of 10 until it gets to this point here. If you have a custom horizon, it uses the custom horizon as the horizon itself. If not, it just happens to be an angle. And as you can see, it says what the present altitude is and whether it's above or below the altitude of the horizon. That allows us to bundle our exposures into groups of 10, and it will keep on going around this loop until such times as it hits the horizon on the way down. We need to add some more controls to make this effective. For instance, as we're changing filters, we need to do autofocus. So for instance, we would add a trigger and would say autofocus after filter change. And equally, we'd add another trigger that says autofocus after temperature change, because we're imaging all night. And I can select a simple time, say 2 degrees. it is at this point you might realise that you want to do slewing and centering. So you'd immediately think, oh, I shall add a slew and centering command and then move it up to here. There we go. So it slews and centers, then does exposures. But it would do that each time it went round this loop, rather unnecessarily. So by doing bottom up rather than top down in terms of structure, it sometimes creates a problem along the way. And the answer is to create another set of instructions that can loop round on their own account. So under the Instructions tab, I'm going to drag in a sequential set of instructions around here. Okay? And then these instructions I'm going to drag into it and then make the loop condition that we had here and put that in here. So now, if I just rename this and say take pictures, what we have now is a loop with no loop conditions. It just goes through the once, it does an initial slew and center, and then it goes into a loop where it takes pictures endlessly until it gets to the horizon. What we've learnt there is we can move by dragging instructions and loop conditions from different parts of the sequence to others. And the last little thing we can do is add some other triggers to this which are universally applied. If you notice, we have a transit at the south, which means we're going to do a meridian flip. So for instance, we might want to do a global trigger for meridian flip, and there are several other global triggers that you can apply, but right now I'm just going to leave it at meridian flip because sometimes these can interfere with the operation where you don't, for instance, want it to restore guiding whilst you're doing autofocus and things like that. When putting together a sequence with your loops and your instructions and your triggers, you need to read it like the computer does. And yes, we have some basic instructions about exposure and doing things like slewing and centering, but we've forgotten a whole bunch of things, like we need to initially focus the system, and we also need to think about how we start up the telescope. If you notice, there is still a sequence start area up here. What I would typically do is drag a new set of instructions up here, and in these instructions I would typically add information about my dome. So I would open the dome, and then I would, on my telescope, I need to home the mount because my particular mount needs a home position before it will go anywhere. And I can then call this startup. I might also be starting off with a warm camera, and I might need to warm the camera. So again, camera, call camera, and I can tell it what temperature to go to and how long to take to get there, say 10 minutes. So I now have a startup routine which will get everything going, and it'll then proceed. Now, a couple of other things that you might want to do is that when you find the home, the telescope is tracking, and you might want to do an initial autofocus because that's the best time to do it, because when you want to do centering, it'll require the stars to be focused for the plate solver to work. So I could say run autofocus. Now, when you look down here, there may be an autoguider running, but the autoguider isn't running at the moment. So there may be other instructions that you put in here that says, whoops, wrong button, that button there. Instructions, guider, start guiding. Now again, that's put the start guiding at the bottom here, so I've got to drag it into position. So now, if I collapse that down so we get some clarity about what's on screen, and just collapse that down, we can now see that it does a slew and center, it starts guiding, and then it starts our exposure loop. So it's starting to come together, and you can do this endlessly. You can have multiple targets. So for instance, if you wanted to create another target that would operate at the second half of the night, you can duplicate it, and it will duplicate everything including the slew and center and the start guiding, but we also need to give it a different target to work with. So again, I can now look at my targets, and I can look at something that sets in the second half of the night, drag that to here. So now I have under M45 something that is setting before midnight, and then in the second one it's picking up at about midnight and setting at dawn. So that would be a good combination of targets that are run one after the other. And that is because we've chosen a loop condition that is dependent on the target and the horizon as opposed to an arbitrary time. Now, equally, as there was a startup area, there's also a sequence end area. And we can also drag a set of instructions down there. And in here, what you typically would do is you would warm up your camera to ambient over a period of time. So instructions, camera, warm camera, and warm it over a period of 10 minutes so don't give it any thermal shock. You also would want to park your mount, followed by shutting the roof. And that would be a typical closeout sequence. And it also might be something you'd do if you had unsafe conditions. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how to use templates to build up complicated sets of instructions that allow you to very quickly customize it for what you want to do. And that includes coping with unsafe conditions during the night and during unattended operation. So, thank you for watching.